All right, welcome back to class, everybody. I'm glad you're still showing up, even though we're getting close to finals. We are going to cover a two-part lecture today. This is part one of models of sanctification. Next week, we're going to get into the cross-centered models of salvation. But for today, we're just going to cover deification, Christus Victor, penal substitution, and moral exemplar. And so I made a chart up here that I would really like you guys to copy into your notes because it is going to be important. It will greatly help you on the final. There is a problem that each of these models of salvation attempts to solve. And then we're going to talk about what Christ does in each of these, what holiday it ties into, because does all connect. And finally, we're going to talk about how we can participate in each of these models of salvation, or in my least favorite, how we should not participate in that model of salvation. So, to kick us off, we're going to talk about deification. The problem here is that we recognize and understand that we are separated from God, the divine, through death, corruptibility, sin, all of those types of things. We're separated from the Lord. And so what this model tries to do is is to get rid of that separation to unite us with the divine nature of God. And if you've been paying attention to what we've been talking about in class, that'll make more sense. And then what Christ does in this, Christ becomes human so that humans can become divine. And the holiday that this most closely ties into is actually Christmas, not Easter. Christmas is when Jesus came down and was human and took on our flesh for us so that he could live a life that we couldn't, so Easter could eventually come. But this model of salvation really does focus on Christ coming, being divine, to give us a chance later in Easter where we can also become divine ourselves. And then finally, when we can participate in this is concerning asceticism, which is really defined as living a life of discipline. So here I want you guys to focus on living as if your corruptions have been overcome. That's huge. You get to live like you've actually been freed from sin, which is how we should all be living. We should all be ecstatic. We should all be joyful. And we should all want to share that with everyone. And then finally, another way you can participate in that is to regularly take communion, however often your church does so you can participate in that with Christ. The second one of salvation we're going to cover is Christus Victor. I hope you guys all understand that translates to Christ is victorious. The problem that this model tries to solve is about evil powers, sin, and death that brings oppression to humans. So there's a slight difference here. For deification, there is divine separation. And here, Christus Victor talks more about the oppression that we all suffer due to that separation. And then the solution to the oppression is liberation. Obviously, we're liberated because Christ conquers. And the holiday tied into that is Easter because that is when Christ conquered the grave. So we have Good Friday, where he died for our sins, and Easter, where he rose again, conquering the grave, which allows us to become more divine, but really we focus on Christ is victorious so that we can be liberated and be free. One of the major consequences of Christus Victor is that it reminds us that we are supposed to live every day fighting for justice going forward. Um, Penal substitution is where the problem is God is angry with you because of the sin, not just original sin, but all of your sin. God is full of rage, anger, all of those things. And so that's the problem. And so the way to solve God's anger is punishment, basically being damned to hell. And so from that, Christ's role in this model of salvation is Christ endured that punishment in our place. He basically became our whipping boy. And that holiday that ties with this is Good Friday, the day that Christ was tortured and nailed to the tree. And then finally, the way that we get the opportunity to participate in penal substitution is to loathe ourselves, have major self-guilt. I just want to tell you right now, don't recommend this one. Don't teach this one in your churches. Just stay away from it. It's unhealthy. It's very dangerous. And finally, the last one we'll cover today is moral exemplar. The problem here is that we as humans continue to fail to love appropriately the way that we were created and are now being called to live. And so Christ's solution to that is he teaches us how to love. But how does Christ do that? Well, his role is to teach us to love by both word and deed, action and what we speak. And finally, the holiday that ties into that, well, it's really every day because we get to be alive every day, we get to be happy about that, and we have a new opportunity to love people in every single day. And finally, we participate in that by loving our neighbor, even our neighbors that are unlovable. I hope you took notes. I hope you wrote all of this down. If you need to, I can send a picture of this in the Canvas for you guys. It's definitely going to be important. This will all be on the test. Please go ahead and submit any and all questions you have, and I will answer those in the second video. And then next week, we will cover part 2, the cross-centered salvation models. So we had a really good question brought up in Canvas that I am really grateful was asked because it shows me I did not do a clear enough job in emphasizing certain things. So thank you for asking that. Ms. Henderson, she asked about penal substitution, and while she does disagree with it and she can see the harm in it, are there certain parts of it that are strong or that are good or that we can implement in the other models of salvation? I think that is a great question. To be clear on the reason why I really despise penal substitution is it has so often been used as a powerful spiritual tool to abuse people, to control people, to manipulate people, and to damage others. So I believe it is a very, very dangerous model of salvation, and I still do not want it to show up in your church, to show up in your sermon, to show up in your teaching, whatever form of ministry you're in. And some of the weaknesses of penal substitution is that it divides the Trinity. You don't see the God of Christianity or truly much of the God of the New Testament in this at all. You basically see the Old Testament angry side of God, and you don't see any of the redeeming parts of that. And because of that, and the depth of that can be taken into, it can be incredibly hard to distinguish between God and the devil. So when you take this seriously, you dive deeply into it, it's very dangerous for both you and those you would want to minister to. Miss Henderson brought up that she was taught all of these, like just different puzzle pieces growing up in the church, and she can see how they all sort of fit together in different ways, which they absolutely do. That's why my favorite sits right in between these two, because I think they are the most powerful ones out of all that we'll learn even next week's. And these are the two that I center my personal life, my personal relationship with Christ, and my ministry around. That said, penal substitution does highlight not only the death that Christ endured, but truly the suffering and the torture of that and the sacrifice that Christ made. And Ms. Henderson brought up the fact that we are very, very desensitized to death in today's world and in our culture, and that's very, very true. And so while penal substitution does emphasize that and it is its strength, it becomes its weakness when that is all that we see, all that we act within, and then we try to hate ourselves. And we try to put ourselves down to put Christ up so that we become the whipping boy that Christ was for us in this model of salvation. So what I noticed I did not be clear enough on in our lecture, that I'm grateful she pointed out to me, is that in every one of these, there is a problem of sin, death, corruptibility, oppression, failure to love is failure to be in right communion with God, right relationship with Him. And within all of these things, we still see the suffering and the torture and the sacrifice that Jesus struggled with and dealt with on the cross. So it is important when covering these with your congregation or in a Sunday school class or even from the pulpit that you do go into more depth so people can understand what Christ endured for us. I do think calling Christ whipping boy can go too far in certain contexts, so you want to be really careful, but highlighting that he endured punishment in our place is huge. All of these salvation models and those we'll cover next week also agree that Christ did this for us, and they do highlight them, and I did not do a good enough job in our once over about explaining that, and that is why I would still say penal substitution is not a good replacement of any of them or is not a puzzle piece I would hope that you bring up in your church. I think you can absolutely talk about what Christ did for us and the true sacrifice and suffering and torture that was, without talking about any of the rest of that. You can see this in these problems, and you will see it even more clearly in our next lecture next week. So I hope that answers the question well enough. If you have any follow-up, just let me know, especially not just listeners, but all of you. But that is why I would still hold on to this, absolutely, but this is within all of them, and I need to do a better job at making that clear. Thank you guys. Keep sending in your questions, and if you need any help on the final, just let me know.